Welcome back to Space Curiosities. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 7 insane facts about the Apollo program that ultimately landed humans on the moon. Number 1. The Apollo budget. The program cost for Apollo between 1961 and 1972 was 25.4 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money, but when accounting for inflation in today's money, that $25.4 billion is roughly equivalent to $153 billion. To put that in perspective, the Mars Science Laboratory mission only had a budget of $2.5 billion. That's about 60 times less money than the whole of the Apollo program after adjusting for inflation. This may seem like a lot of money for a single program, but Apollo was operational at the height of the space race when technological milestones were happening on a yearly basis. Through the early stages, the US was falling behind when accomplishing these milestones. The Soviets launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, beating the United States to this accomplishment by over 3 months' time. Again, in 1961, the Soviet Union successfully launched the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. In this case, the Soviet Union beat the United States by merely weeks by getting a human into space. These milestones made the United States look like failures. To this notion, President John F. Kennedy rallied the United States to achieve the largest technological milestone in human history, landing multiple groups of astronauts on the moon. A program conceived in the early 1960s by the Eisenhower administration as a follow-up to the highly successful Project Mercury, NASA was allotted the most funding it would ever see to make the Apollo program a success. It took over $25 billion, but no other human accomplishment compares. It has been 50 years and no other country has come close to returning to the moon with manned missions, even though the technology that we have today is vastly superior. In my opinion, I think $25 billion was 100% worth it. What do you think? Number 2. The launch vehicle. The Saturn V rocket is still to this day the most powerful heavy launch vehicle ever engineered to go into service. Weighing a staggering 3 million kilograms, or 6.5 million pounds, it had the capability of launching 48,600 kilograms, or 107,100 pounds, to the moon. That sounds like a lot, right? Well, let's compare it to some common objects. That's roughly equivalent to 500 fully grown adult males, 10 adult male killer whales, or 17 fully loaded F-150s. That's a lot of lifting power. Here are some of the launch statistics for the Saturn V. At its most powerful iteration, the 3 stages of the Saturn V produced a whopping 7.9 million pounds of thrust at liftoff for the Apollo 15 mission. In comparison, the J-58 turbo ramjet engine fitted to the fastest plane in the world, the SR-71 Blackbird, had a maximum output thrust of 32,500 pounds with full afterburners. If pounds of thrust are not a metric that you're used to, let's go with horsepower. The horsepower of the SR-71 Blackbird was about 160,000 horsepower. In comparison to the Saturn V, the first stage alone had 160 million horsepower. That's about 1,000 times more powerful than the fastest plane to ever fly. If that number still doesn't make that much sense, let's compare it to the fastest car in the world, the Bugatti Chiron. With approximately 1,500 horsepower, it would take over 100,000 of these cars to be equivalent of the power of the first stage of the Saturn V. All of these numbers are extremely impressive, but remember, this technology was developed in the 1960s. Number 3. The Apollo computer. The smartphone you might be using to watch this video has more computing power than the Apollo guidance computer. A typical smartphone in 2019 has anywhere between 2 and 8 gigabytes of random access memory, or RAM, and upwards of 1 terabyte of storage. The Apollo guidance computer, which landed men on the moon and returned them safely to Earth, had roughly 32,768 bits of RAM, roughly 4 kilobytes, and 72 kilobytes of read-only memory. Let that sink in. 4 kilobytes of RAM and 72 kilobytes of ROM. Your phone has more than 1 million times the amount of RAM that achieved the greatest feat in human history. Memory isn't the only thing that matters, though. The processor on the Apollo guidance computer ran at 0.0043 megahertz, while the latest generation of iPhones have a processor that runs at 2.49 gigahertz. That's almost 100,000 times more processing power. Imagine if the Apollo guidance computer had the same computing technology that a smartphone has, let alone a modern computer. What do you think it could accomplish? Number 4. The Apollo 1 tragedy. In a tragic beginning to the manned portion of the Apollo program, Apollo 1 was set to launch from Kennedy Space Center on February 21st, 1967. The inaugural voyage of the Apollo Command and Service Module was meant to be launched to low Earth orbit and manned by a crew of 3. The mission was designed to last for up to 2 weeks and was intended to test the Command and Service Module as well as the Saturn 1B launch vehicle. Unfortunately, during routine testing on January 27, 1967, an electrical fire broke out in the Command and Service Module and was accelerated by a pure oxygen atmosphere. Sadly, the crew of 3 did not survive. To pay respect to the lost astronauts, their wives encouraged NASA to commemorate the mission as Apollo 1, even though it never went to space. This tragedy halted the Apollo program for 20 months and prompted a redesign of the Command and Service Module to correct the major safety concerns that led to the tragedy. The pure oxygen atmosphere was changed to 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen. Additionally, the new Apollo spacesuits were to be made out of a non-flammable fiberglass material instead of nylon. You may be asking yourself, why was the module filled with pure oxygen? Isn't that a disaster waiting to happen? Your questions are valid, and the designers of the module took this into consideration. What was the main reasoning behind their decision to not dilute the atmosphere with nitrogen? It was to reduce the chance of the astronauts getting decompression sickness. I don't know about you, but I think I'd rather risk getting the bends as opposed to a higher risk of a catastrophic fire. May the crew of Apollo 11 rest in peace. Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger B. Chaff. Number 5. Apollo 13. The infamous Apollo 13 mission was the only manned flight of the Apollo program considered to be a total failure. 2 days after a successful launch on April 11, 1970, a liquid oxygen tank exploded. The Apollo 13 crew initially thought a couple of different things may have occurred. One crew member, Jim Lovell, thought that another crew member, Fred Hayes, had initiated the lunar module's cabin repressurization valve, which makes a large bang, kind of like an explosion. The final crew member, Jack Swigert, thought that a meteorite struck the lunar module. Upon inspection, Hayes discovered that 2 of the 3 fuel cells were dead, forcing the astronauts to abort the mission. When they got back into communication with Houston, Lovell discovered that gas was being vented into space. Soon after, they discovered that 2 of the oxygen tanks were bled dry. This led to many problems for the return flight. The astronauts had to improvise a way to remove CO2, limit the usage of energy, and conserve food and water for the 4-day journey back to Earth. Additionally, in their attempt to conserve energy, the astronauts powered down the electronics to most of the equipment in the spacecraft, causing the temperature to plummet to a low of 4 degrees Celsius. The low temperature ended up being a major cause for concern as water began to condense on the inside of the lunar module. As most of you may know, water and electricity don't mix. If there was a shortage in the remaining operating electronics, it could have been a critical failure that may have caused a result to the loss of all the astronauts on board. Fortunately, the Apollo 13 lunar module made it safely back to Earth and splashed down in the South Pacific on April 17, 1970, 4 days after the explosion. All 3 crew members were home safe and sound. Number 6. The rock samples. Every mission that landed on the moon had slightly different mission objectives. Despite this, each crew had an objective to return samples collected from the lunar surface. The amount of rocks increased from 21.5 kilograms, or about 47.5 pounds, with Apollo 11, to 110.4 kilograms, or 243 pounds, with the final Apollo 17 mission. Because of the significance of the samples, the crews of each mission left cameras, backpacks, and other equipment on the surface of the moon to reduce weight for the ascent and rendezvous with the lunar orbiter. Number 7. The theft and loss of moon rocks. Speaking of rocks returned from the surface of the moon, did you know that some of the rocks have been stolen or lost? You'd be surprised to know that this hasn't happened on just a single occasion. Many of these rocks, gifted to countries and states, have gone missing and have never been found. Furthermore, researchers were given the opportunity to study some of these rocks, and in some cases, the rocks went missing in their collections. Now to get to the stolen rocks. During the summer of 2002 at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, a group of brazen interns decided to steal a safe containing 101 grams of moon rocks. Headed by Thad Roberts, the interns knew the security details for the facility containing the rocks. Thad was an excellent student majoring in physics, geology, and anthropology, and he was also a pilot, scuba diver, and he was able to speak multiple languages. Despite his outstanding qualities, his strategy to offload the precious samples was not the brightest. Thad advertised the precious samples online to a Belgian mineralogy club. Soon after, the FBI arrested Thad and 2 of his accomplices. He was sentenced to 100 months in prison. When he was asked why he did it, he said he wanted to give the moon to a fellow intern at Johnson Space Center that he had fallen madly in love with. Would you attempt to steal something as precious as moon rocks? For a love interest nonetheless? I don't think I would. Those were 7 insane and in some cases sad facts about the Apollo program. If you're interested in more videos like this, please be sure to leave a new video idea in a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you would like to support this channel, please consider going to my Patreon, link in the description, and until next time, stay curious and go explore.